Now, less than 2 weeks before President Trump enters office for his second term, and all of the issues on the Russia-Ukraine war will come back into sharp focus as he moves not just from making comments, but from issuing directions. And then we'll have the power of the office of the presidency of the United States. And lots of people are wondering how that's going to work out. Trump gave an interview yesterday at Mar-a-Lago, which we've shown you parts of here and there. But we wanted to shift gears a little bit to show you, first of all, what's happening on the ground, because that's going to inform really anything that the Trump administration does when it comes in, is what is the reality on the ground in light of many people's comments. To try to help make some sense of all that, we got one of the better voices out there that we've seen, and we're always happy to have back Patrick Henningsen. He is a geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of SundayWire.com. Patrick, first of all, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Daniel. Appreciate it.
And listen, I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about a lot of important, both tactical and strategic issues regarding the war today. But one of the reasons we're some of our fans, anyway, are really glad to have you on is, well, somewhat different. This is one of the views, comments we've already had on here from one of our most loyal viewers, Svetlana. So I guess that you have multiple benefits besides just your intellectual capacity. So
I'll take that compliment. Definitely, I'll put that in the bank. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Svetlana, by the way, for that. Also, we appreciate you watching the show all the time. Listen, so first of all, let's get at the tactical situation. So a lot of news in the headlines, especially in the Western media over the last week or so, because of a so-called surprise offensive in the Kursk area. That's been going on. That gets a lot of headlines. It doesn't get a lot of analysis, though. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. And I wanted to put up a few comments from and a couple of maps even of what's happening by the Institute for the Study of War. As I always do when I give a caveat, they are really good at maps and they're terrible at analysis. But their maps are really good sometimes because they accurately show what's happening on the ground here. And sometimes even they have to admit the truth on some things. And they've been doing a lot of that of late, because they're forced to. I want to look first of all, the ISW has reported, and again, this is not Russia propaganda. This is Western admissions about what's actually going on the ground. That said that in the last 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours, Russia has been advancing in the Kupiansk, the Toretsk, the Pokrovsk, and the Kursk area. And so I want to kind of take a look at each of those in turn. We'll start with the Kursk. Gary, if you could throw that full screen up there. Sorry, there you go. Sorry, I got out of order a little bit because I think this is important to see for a number of reasons. You see in that green, the bigger green circle in the upper right-hand corner of that, the blue area there toward the center, it was the objective set out by the Ukraine side. That's what got all these big headlines in the West that Ukraine launches an offensive in the Kursk, which I found puzzling because when you actually look at the substance of what they did, it was a very small portion of this front here and a relatively small number of troops. The initial incursion was by basically a company plus about 20 armored vehicles of various types, tanks and armored personnel carriers. And they made some headway, but they ran into a buzzsaw really on the first small village that they had, which they took it's kind of at a T intersection of a road where there's a number of houses. You really can't even call it a village so much as a handful of houses out in the middle of nowhere. They took the southern part of that, but then they couldn't even take the rest of that T intersection. So their success was blunted almost immediately by the Russian side. Then in the northern part of that, just to the left, you kind of can see a pink area just to the left of the second green circle. And that's where Russia took advantage of the Ukrainians' focus trying to go up in this northern area here. And the Russians went south and took additional area, probably because they had maybe moved some of the troops, the Ukrainian troops, from that area to try and make this penetration, which didn't work out too well. And initially, the Ukrainians had employed some new electronic warfare capacities, which rendered apparently all of the FPV drones by the Russian side kind of inert and neutral. So the Russians brought these fiber optic drones in, these cables that are impervious to EW. And so now then today's report says that the Russians aren't even trying the FPV drones until they figure out what was going on. And so they're bringing in more of these wire-guided drones, which can't be stopped by electronic warfare. So I'm not sure that net worked out good for the Ukraine side. But I just wonder your impression of what was the intent of the Ukraine side and what are they going to do now that it doesn't seem to be working?
Yeah, it's it's interesting. I don't really look at this as an offensive as much as it is a provocation. And so Kiev is basically this. You got to look at this like a staged provocation. So they're wanting to do this for a number of reasons. Militarily, the idea that Ukraine or Kiev, the Zelensky regime is going to be able to hold territory in Russia or anything like that. It's kind of patently ridiculous, but it can create problems. And here are the problems it's going to create. It's going to force Russia's hand to be much more strident in dealing with Ukraine. This is going to create leverage ahead of potential ceasefire negotiations with the incoming Trump administration. Now, there's two schools of thought here. One is that this is done to improve Kiev and the United States' position in upcoming potential negotiations. But the other is that this is a way of sabotaging any future ceasefire negotiations from an incoming Trump administration that's really hung their hat on the fact that they're going to deliver a solution very quickly with regards to the Ukraine. So each one of these provocations really pushes back that possibility just a little bit more. So really, it's in a way kind of like a public relations stunt. But most of all, what this does is it helps to reinforce Zelensky's teetering position as the sort of, at the moment, unelected leader, because he's out of term right now. He's declared a state of emergency, suspended elections. And right now, there's a lot of pressure. If you look at the poll numbers, it's changed in terms of public opinion in Ukraine for support for this type of a conflict. And it's going against Zelensky. It's going against NATO and the United States. So think of this like kind of a desperate attempt to try to kind of rescue their position a little bit. But right now, there's a number of characters that have come to the fore that have been doing interviews that are much more public, potential challengers in an election with Zelensky, and that has to come pretty soon. We're talking about Zaluzhny, who's now the Ukrainian ambassador in Britain, former head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and of course Alexei Arestovich, who's decamped in the United States. So they're quite public and they're visible, and that's going to create pressure on Zelensky to somehow legitimize his current position. I think it's a losing gambit, Daniel, all the way around. And I think in the end, and it does another thing, this provocation. It pushes back Russia from what looks like eventually areas that it's going to take full control over, like Sumy. And it also helps to stave off the sort of decline around Kharkiv, which is one of Ukraine's largest cities. And, I have to remember, these are ostensibly Russian oblasts. So the ruling dynamic from Kiev there it's tenuous at best. So if their military is faltering in these areas, don't think that the public support is really going to be there in a big way should the military falter at all.
Well, let me ask you, what do you think is Zelensky's intent in inside of his own head? I'm talking about not anything he's publicly said, because you almost can't take anything at face value, but based on actions, what do you think might be his intention? Because obviously when Trump won the election, it was a seismic shift in what it had been if Harris had won, because she was just going to continue the status quo of the Biden administration. There wouldn't have been any change at all. And now that you took a hard right turn, because now he's going to end the war, maybe even a U-turn, maybe not even a right turn, but major change. So now that he knows that the incoming administration is not going to just keep the blanket going, blanket check, et cetera, they're going to look for reversing the situation, ending the war. But then, regardless of what Biden allowed, Zelensky, because he's the ultimate guy who's going to pay the price for this, chose to start using long-range weapons, which, as you said, I think the same word you used, I used, was a provocation to the Russian side, to which they've responded several times. And then now that he has this incursion, now at the time it was launched basically 3 weeks from the time Trump comes in. But militarily, a handful of long-range missiles, even if Russia didn't shoot them down, which most of them they did, there's not very many. So it's not going to change anything, even at the strategic level, and certainly not at the tactical. This is such a tiny little piece, even though it got big American headlines. Militarily, it was a small, not even a battalion size operation here, and it didn't work. And Zelensky has to have known that was going to happen. Why would he take these actions which will provoke his enemy when he knows the guy, his benefactor coming in, is going to cut the thing off? What does he hope to gain?
I'm not sure. I don't think he has much choice but to kind of continue flailing along in the way that he has. This is kind of interesting what you brought up, how this makes big headlines in America, but isn't that consequential in terms of the wider scheme of things on the ground, in terms of the actual conflict? And having interfaced with recently people in the Beltway's quote intelligence community and people in the SF special forces community and all this, they seem to be kind of very high on all of these activities, like that somehow Zelensky is going to turn the tide with just a little bit more help, a little bit more weapons. We've seen this delusion dragging on like for about almost 3 years now in Washington. And, while they may have had a better argument a year and a half ago, they certainly don't now. But people that I have encountered recently are still stuck in that trance. And it's almost like they really don't want to admit, as do a lot of the incoming Trump advisors and cabinet people, they don't want to admit that they have an extremely weak hand. And Russia holds all the cards here. And the cards that Russia holds are directly tied to the political outcome with Kiev. They can't be done militarily. The only time you can wind this down is going to have to be politically. And Russia's already said very clearly, Vladimir Putin said, we're not going to be doing any negotiations with Zelensky until there's an election. So when is that election going to be? Do you hear anybody talking about that in Washington? Because that's the one thing I would expect to hear, somebody from the Trump administration talking about election dates. You don't hear it. What does that tell you? They either don't have a grip on the issue here. Everybody's avoiding the obvious because nobody wants to be the bearer of bad news. And the bad news is the U.S. has an extremely weak hand to play as a result of what looks like, let's face it, historically, this is going to be viewed as a misadventure on the part of the United States and NATO and Europe more widely.
Now I wonder what your how you view things, because it didn't hardly get any notice here. What's your comment there? What Putin said about I won't. We can talk to anybody, but we can't actually sign a deal until there's a legitimate person, which he said after an election. That was only reported in a handful of places in the West, and I had to look hard to find it, but it hadn't even been talked since. But then you also simultaneously have Putin saying, yeah, I'm willing to talk to Trump, no problem. So I think that he understands that obviously he does, that the benefactor, the only person who's allowing this thing to continue on, is the support that Trump gets. But how do you perceive, and maybe you've even heard, that the Putin negotiating path when he says, yeah, I'll talk to Trump, but we're not going to make a deal until we get somebody besides Zelensky? And how do those two things work together?
I'm sure he'd love to keep a dialogue open with Washington. I mean, that's step one, because there's really not any dialogue going on at the moment between Washington and Moscow. That actually needs to open up immediately. That's positive. That's hopefully going to lead, or at least set the table for some kind of eventual binding negotiations with this. But it's still that political obstacle is in Ukraine. And the longer they keep the situation, the status quo in Kiev, it's really just going to be diminishing returns for Ukraine and Washington and NATO. And there's no two ways around that. So it's a kind of a dangerous gambit that the U.S. is by putting all of their kind of wagering everything on this Zelensky lame duck zombie administration that's becoming. How long can they do that for? 3 months, 6 months, or something like that? Because a lot of this is, if you look at the statements from European leaders, like the new incoming Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, from the Dutch successor to Jan Stoltenberg, his statements are very much vanity oriented. Like, we can't allow Putin to win. We can't allow Putin to be seen to win. We hear similar statements echoed by British parliamentarians and cabinet defense ministers and so forth. We also see this in other parts of Europe, and the European von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, the new kind of foreign policy guru who doesn't seem to know what she's doing. They're all kind of stuck on this. We can't allow Russia to be seen to win. We can't give them that encouragement. And as the trope goes, if Russia believes that it won, it will then steamroll the rest of Europe. And we've talked about how ridiculous of a scenario that is. But I really feel, Daniel, and I know we spoke about this earlier, that the West has just propagandized itself so badly, that it's been submersed in its own propaganda for so long that there's just the dialogue in the body politic. It's just not happening. Like
Wow.
that's a problem, because it just puts you, it just puts you way behind. Eventually, you're going to have to be there with reality. But the sooner you get to reality, the better. But it's not happening yet. It's really.
Well, see, I think that what struck me is what you said a second ago, and I wanted to point this out, because I was like, wait a minute, did you just tell me you talk to people privately, not people making public statements, but privately in the intelligence community or in the special forces community, that actually think what they're saying is true, what they just conveyed?
Yeah, I don't know if they think it's true, but they feel like that's what they have to say, because they don't want to offend the rest of the community, and nobody wants to be the one to say we're losing. So everybody, it's kind of groupthink. It's groupthink, Daniel. You know.
Wow. Well, we need a new group then, because I mean, we just showed you the Kursk area, which was already. Gary, if you could put that Kursk map back up there again, look at what's going on here. Okay, so all the red area on the left and on the right, now in the north part, that's the circumstance that Ukraine had gotten at the high water mark of the initial incursion into the Kursk area, and that's all the stuff that has been taken back. The orange areas there are areas where Russia is now moving into pushback. So you see that the blue area in the middle, the dark blue, that's what Ukraine still holds to this day. But as you can see, forming an opportunity there, you can see what looks like the Russian plan here is that instead of like taking Suja, a relatively medium-sized village that would be hard to take, they look like they're moving more toward the south, and on the other side in the north, they're moving also toward to cut off the only major road. There's really only one or two major roads left from Ukraine where they can get support to cut that off. Once they cut that off, they don't have to take the rest of it by force. They can just choke it to death, and then they'll run out of supplies, in short order. So that's the military situation. Aside from this incorrectly called offensive, it was just another counterattack within, but the overall situation is clearly falling apart. That's one. Then we go to Toretsk. That's another one of the major cities here, and you see this is again from the Institute for the Study of War, and you can see just a little bit of area. Actually, all of it now, even the outskirts of the town are in the gray zone, so-called, which is a contested zone. All the rest of it is Russian now. So that village is virtually gone. Then we go to the Pokrovsk area. If you can throw that one up, Gary. This continues. Every one of these areas in the green circles there are Russian advances and where the fighting's going on, and the yellow areas where they continue to move closer towards Pokrovsk. The city has already mostly been abandoned, and even though the Russians haven't taken it yet, they have basic fire control over the whole thing. So it's already of limited or no use to the Ukrainians, because some of the rail lines are already now in Russian control that come out of Pokrovsk, so that's no longer usable for them. Everywhere you want to look, and if we had more time, we could go into the Kupiansk area up in the north, new Russian advances there, all the way down to the south into Zaporizhia area, more Ukrainian losses in those areas. The Russians have been using they've been increasing use of their air power in these glide bombs that have been coming in and attacking areas beyond the front line, potentially setting the stage for a bigger operations to come. There was reporting from a Ukrainian source that I had yesterday that said that their intelligence is showing that there is a massing of about 150,000 Russian troops outside of Pokrovsk, in addition to what's on the current line, which implies, especially when you look at the increase in air power, that the Russians could be possibly we're getting ready for another big offensive. If they don't, we don't know what that 100,000 is going to do. But without that, Patrick, all of these things that I've shown you from the north all the way down to the end of the operation lines in the east, Russia is on the move forward. Ukraine cannot stop it, no matter how many billions of dollars Biden has been trying to shovel out the door. At what point, please help me understand here, to any of these self-deluded people you're just talking about finally acknowledge this is a lost war?
On top of everything that you've just laid out there, Daniel, the other thing that I'm so shocked, speaking especially to Americans, I think people who are active duty military understand things, and former veterans like yourself, how important it is to maintain robust and really well stocked supply lines and logistical lines of support. And I don't think Americans, for some reason, or the people who are kind of armchair war hawks, who are kind of believing in this wonder weapons mythology, like some that just need some exotic weapons going to somehow give Ukraine some strategic advantage and turn the tide. If you've been on the ground of the Russian and Ukrainian border, which I have, and seen just the scale of the Russian logistical supply lines, they have whole fleets of alligator choppers, thousands of supply trucks, the fuel lines, the road surfaces are vastly superior in the areas that Russia is operating on, and so forth. I mean, to have that advantage, they can just grind this out for an infinite period of time. And the political will is in there in Russia to do that, so long as they make some gradual progress. I think the public's generally happy, and there's not massive loss of life, especially on the Russian side. Russia holds all those cards. Ukraine doesn't. They're vastly under-resourced. They don't have the kind of strategic advantages or the air power that Russia has, the technological power, and just the sheer manpower. It's not even close. So to think that any of this, that they're doing these provocations, can make any military difference strategically, all it is short-term tactical moves. And I would argue that a lot of the tactical moves have political motivation behind them, either in Kiev or in Washington and Brussels. So it's not a
kind of political motivation
game. What was that, Daniel?
What kind of political motivations?
Political motivation, survival of whoever has sunk political capital into this. Obviously, Zelensky's crew, his inner circle, they need to survive. The British are heavily invested in this. Keir Starmer, the new British Prime Minister, straight over with his unflagging support. You have a number of European countries. France is trying to, sink their last big commitment in there to talk about, putting French boots on the ground in some kind of a peacekeeping role or ceasefire role in the future. Everybody is kind of positioning themselves to sort of rescue the situation. And Washington, it was an election issue, let's face it. But as we know with U.S. politics, what someone campaigns on doesn't necessarily come out to be true when they start office. And that's another potential worry, is that somehow the goalposts might be moved when Trump comes in office, if it's seen that the deal that he's looking for is not available.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a second, but I want to stick to your comment there, or your observation on the political posturing and how people want to basically CYA kind of situation. My perception, and I'd like to hear your comment on this after you see the following couple of clips here, is that the outgoing Biden administration is doing everything they can to cover their own butts and to lay the foundation that we did everything that we could. We had Ukraine on a sustainable path, so that if the expected end happens and either Ukraine loses the war because those trends continue on, or Trump negotiates any kind of a negotiated end to it where it cedes territory, that they'll say, we had a good situation and you blew it. If anybody has any doubts about that, let me show you what Anthony Blinken, current Secretary of State for another couple of weeks, said in a recent kind of an exit interview where he was asked some pretty pointed questions. Watch this one first.
Right now, where as I'm looking at this, I think the real measure of success is whether going forward Ukraine will continue to stand strong as an independent country, increasingly integrated with Western institutions, and able to stand on its own feet militarily, economically, democratically. And in each of those areas, we put Ukraine on a trajectory to do that.
Do you think it's time to end the war, though?
These are decisions for Ukrainians to make.
What planet is he on that they're in an increasingly strong position diplomatically, economically, and militarily, and we have them on this path? The only path is the one we just showed you, where they're getting crushed.
Yeah, and it's the same trope, Daniel. You hear that, oh, this is something for the Ukrainians to decide. We're just going to give them the weapons, and they're brave, and they want to keep fighting. So as long as they want to keep fighting, we're going to keep supplying them, and we'll keep the war going. That trope has just been completely recycled for like the last 3 years. And it's not true. because the little polling that we do see in the last 3 months shows that the public is turning against the war effort, but they're not allowed to have elections because Zelensky's declared himself dictator. So, I mean, where is that in the conversation with Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State? It's not allowed in the conversation. So he has another agenda privately, and then he has this public position that he's putting out that nobody takes seriously. It's almost embarrassing to watch him basically trying to put like some kind of a glossy sheen over, one of the biggest disasters. This probably will go down in history as one of the biggest foreign policy disasters in the history of the United States of America, and Tony Blinken was running point on it.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. In fact, I think that this will way outstrip what happened with the Afghanistan disaster, which was horrible in its own right. But I think the scale is enormously bigger here, and certainly the loss of human life of our alleged ally is just through the roof. Only because we basically, it's similar in my view that if you have a patient who's on life support and you keep them on life support only so that they can die in more agony, because you can't stop the end. The end is determined. It's already medically impossible for this person to stay alive. But instead of, letting taking it off the machine and letting it go, you want to cause more harm to this person, more anguish to their relatives, etc. It's not a perfect analogy, but we're basically keeping on life support this war, because without it, it would have ended long ago, and the death and destruction would have ended long ago.
Worse, Daniel, it's wrecked the European economy. It's weakened our allies. It will ultimately weaken NATO, and it is compromise NATO as an institution through its credibility, its ability to act or to do anything in concert. This misadventure will be ultimately the undoing of NATO, and all we can do in the audience is pray that this isn't going to spiral or cascade into a third world war at this point. That's like all we can do. And so I'm not impressed with Antony Blinken at all.
Well, if you were only merely not impressed, this may lower it, another level lower. So in this next clip here, it's not just that he says things that are outlandish, but now that he's just going to outright lie. Watch what he says here in relation to whether there has been any chance for a negotiated settlement prior to today.
Look, I worked very hard in the lead up to the war, including meetings with my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Geneva a couple of months before the war, trying to find a way to see if we could prevent it, trying to test the proposition whether this was really about Russia's concerns for its security, concerns somehow about Ukraine and the threat that it posed, or NATO and the threat that it posed, or whether this was about what it in fact is about, which is Putin's imperial ambitions and the desire to recreate a greater Russia, to subsume Ukraine back into Russia. But we had to test that proposition, and we were intensely engaged diplomatically with Russia. Since then, had there been any opportunity to engage diplomatically in a way that could end the war on just and durable terms, we would have been the first to seize them. Unfortunately, at least till this moment, we haven't seen any signs that Russia's been genuinely prepared to engage. I hope that changes.
Man, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's just start with the end where he said there has been no opportunity to seek a negotiated settlement, except maybe the one at the second month of the war in Istanbul. What say you?
Well, there's that. Let's just go back to the beginning. He said, I was working hard before the war with my counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. That's a total bold-faced lie on the part of Tony Blinken. The Russians issued a state communique to the United States, very clear about its security concerns months before the conflict. And what did Tony Blinken and the U.S. do? They sat on it. They gave them the hand, and they basically ignored them, allowed the situation to continue to fester on the Ukrainian side. And this is just beside the fact that the United States was actively involved, at least giving the dog whistle to Germany and also to France to basically sandbag and ultimately torpedo the Minsk peace accords. The basis of the Minsk accords is what more or less came out at Istanbul just a month into the conflict, which the U.S. and its allies actively undermined, intentionally undermined. And so for him to have this kind of history revisionism here, and he said, we wanted to test the proposition. So testing the proposition was to do everything you could to force a conflict with the Russians over this issue. So that, I mean, the level of deception, this guy is such a snake as a diplomat. I mean, it really, for him to do one of these sort of memoir podcasts on his way out the door and put that on record. I mean, these people, it's hard to take them seriously at this point. They've presided over failure after failure. I don't even want to talk about Tony Blinken's role in seeing the Middle East go up in absolute embers so far, his role in that. So, I mean, this is just unbelievable.
Yeah, and because that comment, it's one thing to exaggerate or to, omit certain information, but what he said in the beginning of there, in my view, was an outright intentional known lie. But to say that, well, we wanted to test a proposition. Is it really about your national security? Is it really about what you've been saying about NATO coming into the border? Or is it about something else? And then we found out that it's about imperial imperialism. What does that even mean? That Lavrov told him that, hey, listen, I know we say about NATO, but really we want to recreate the USSR. I mean, obviously that never happened because it's not true. But for him to say that is just it's just astounding to me.
Yeah, it's just trope. Everyone's been using that line. It's almost like that's the copy and paste. One of the favorite copy and paste lines when you're talking about Russia and Ukraine is Putin wants to reinstitute the glory of the Russian Empire. I mean, there's no proof of that at all. And he's had 25 years to do it as president. He hasn't done it. So, I mean, come on. All of the opportunities were there. And, that's the lesson here. All of the opportunities were there, and they were there for a long time. They were there for 9 years. 9 years after the United States and Victoria Nuland were involved in instigating a coup d'etat in Maidan in Kiev in February of 2014. So there are so many opportunities to avoid the deal Ukraine could have got at any time from 2015 till 2021, and even after the conflict had already kicked off at Istanbul. The deal they could have got is just unbelievable. Like, it would have been the deal of the century compared to the one they have now.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the real takeaway.
Yeah, that's what I've seen. This a couple of maps out there, which I'm sure are going to resurface at some point, which is just anguishing for me to look at. Is that you have Ukraine and at the end of 2013, which was all blue to include Crimea, but because of the U.S. intervention and then subsequently the NATO intervention, you're going to have what is the result of that, which is going to be half of Ukraine gone. Congratulations. Thank you, NATO, for what you have done. That's going to be the real legacy of the people like Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, you mentioned there as well. And you also referenced a second ago talking to some some military folks and some special forces, et cetera. Well, we have here one shot of at least on paper, and a very highly credentialed American politician and former military guy, David Petraeus, former CIA director. I mean, literally on paper for a resume on LinkedIn, about the best that you could possibly get. Unfortunately, he has about the most horrific track record on issues of war and peace that can be imagined, but somehow people don't get that. Well, if they don't get it, hadn't gotten it before, maybe they want to reconsider after hearing this.
I hope the administration in its final weeks will just push everything into the pipeline that they possibly can. And I believe they are doing that. So if we can enable President Zelensky to change the dynamic on the battlefield with his military, then I think you could have real negotiations with President Zelensky for the first time publicly acknowledging that he might have to give up the 20% of the country that's occupied by Russia, not forever and ever, but certainly during the period of a ceasefire. But then we would have to absolutely guarantee this with boots on the ground from ideally European forces that are meaningful and effective and capable. Even better would be U.S. and European forces. I mean, the best of all would be NATO membership.
Okay, this is just astounding from a military perspective, as the Blinken one was from a diplomatic perspective. You still think that it's possible to get all this stuff out the door at the 3-year mark of this war, and that's going to suddenly make Ukraine's army strong to compel Putin into a negotiation to benefit Kiev. I mean, where does this guy come off saying that kind of stuff?
It sounds like more like a business pitch. You know, we got to empty the stocks so that we can backfill it with new gear. And by the way, my company, my corporation, or the boards that I sit on are going to be profiting from that. You know, it's funny. I remember a special forces veteran telling me in 2012, I think 2013, 2012, and the name David Petraeus came up. He said, "Oh, David, betray us." That was his nickname among, some veteran soldiers or even some active duty soldiers. He's not very well regarded in retrospect. Seen by many, although he gets credited for the quote the surge, which is kind of a ridiculous credit that he gets from the Fox News General Jack Keane crowd. I think should be regarded as a total failure as a general, as a military head, because he presided over one of the worst disasters in the history of the United States that ruined the Middle East. So what are his credentials to come and weigh in on this? And here's the problem with the Trump administration. So all of these vultures are circling the White House right now. They're circling the buffet at Mar-a-Lago. Okay, they all want a piece of the action, whether that's an advisory position, a cabinet position, contracts. They want to be in the inner circle. These are mercenary firms. These are the KBRs of the world, all of these guys. And what would they want more than anything, Daniel? They want to redeploy. They want to see a redeployment in Afghanistan. They want to see, I hear this a lot now, okay, a lot, and a redeployment in an upping of the U.S. footprint in Syria and Iraq. So you need two things for that to happen. One, you need to restart the war on terror. So you need a war on terror 2.0. I'm all the noises I'm hearing from all the punditry and people like David Petraeus are all pushing that. So the Ukraine thing, he might be making a sales pitch here just to be relevant in public. I don't think he's going to get anywhere with that. Personally, I don't. I don't think it's wise, and I don't think Europe wants it either. But these guys are also putting themselves back in the game to profit from a restart of all the different failures that they themselves were involved in over the last 25 years, talking about the Middle East. So that's that, and they're circling the Trump administration right now. And these are the conversations. So this is what the Hawks are doing. Jake Sullivan himself is, very. He's saying we're having conversations with the transition team right now on X, Y, and Z, and we think that this is this. So there's total coordination behind the scenes to keep a lot of these conflicts going, and then who knows, to escalate. And a war with Iran, certainly that's on the cards with the Trump administration. It feels like a fait accompli depending on who you're talking to right now. So
well, I was just kind of reinforce that. I'll see if Gary can dig this up in a minute ago. I sent you a week or so ago a quote by Pompeo, who seems to be doing precisely what you're talking about there. But when you're talking about the vultures that are circling looking for money, here's the first guy in line.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. It's the breadbasket of really the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes out of Ukraine. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals, a good deal for Ukraine and us, and he's going to bring peace.
How can these people say this stuff out loud? It's one thing by saying stuff like Blinken does about democracy and freedom and all the stuff with your mouth in front of the camera, but then behind the scenes, maybe doing this kind of stuff, whatever. But this guy, Lindsey Graham, is just overtly saying it out loud. It's about cash and we want it.
He's talking. He's the spokesperson for the bondholders of the debt that we are currently and continuously piling on top of Ukraine, debt that we'll never be able to pay back. But it's having to basically promise its resources, or what's left of any of its resources, to the West, to the people, to the bondholders, to their creditors. And when you're talking about what territory they've lost, that was the ROI for BlackRock, for all of these massive funds that were basically parking their money behind a totally different outcome from this conflict. And they wanted to privatize and basically loot, rape, and pillage, basically finish off Ukraine with what little was left after George Soros got done with it for the last 25 years. They pick apart the carcass and take what's left. And of course, the rare earth minerals, Lindsay's talking about that. And so that was the ROI. They're upset. They're not getting their ROI. And I wonder, Daniel, if a lot of the craziness that you see in Washington, this doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on this bad bet, is the bondholders, is the big money in the background pushing their politicians, saying, do something. We need an ROI. We've lost here. There's nothing for us here. If Russia continues on the line of contact where it currently is and maybe increases its position to the Dnieper River, they're beside themselves. But these are not military people. These are bankers. These are people sitting in Manhattan. These are people sitting in the city of London. They're in Dusseldorf and Frankfurt. Okay, they don't understand. To them, it's a game of Risk. It's a board game. But the realities on the ground, they're so out of touch with. And Lindsey Graham is the embodiment of that, because he's the mouthpiece of that big money. And so this is like, you can make an opera out of this. It's just so amazing, the lessons that are baked into all this, the mythology and everything else. It's incredible.
And of course, what's tragic and horrific is that the consequence of all those mouthpieces and all these bankers that you're talking about, et cetera, and all these people who are not military personnel, but they're just looking at the spreadsheet and saying, wow, there could be some big benefit here, is the bill payers are the Ukrainian people. They're the ones who keep paying for this. Their territory is what's getting turned into rubble, et cetera. And there just is so little human compassion that it just wounds my soul. I mean, it's not even just making me angry. It's just deeply disturbing as a human being that the human capital and the human flesh doesn't seem to matter to these people. And they want to keep going with something that can't succeed anyway. They won't even get their money. They're basically laying the foundation, in my view, to handing it over to Vladimir Putin. And your lust for having all this stuff, you're setting the conditions where you won't get any of it. Because consider this, you said it a second ago, if we had made that deal in Istanbul in 2022, all of this territory would be open for the picking, and they could have made deals. He could have done all this stuff, and they could have benefited from it.
Yep.
Now they're going to lose it all.
Yep, they had it. I mean, obviously, Crimea is a different story. That's, from Russia's point of view, that's always been a non-negotiable because of Sevastopol, and historically, that is Russia, basically, at least officially up until 1953, when Nikita Khrushchev gave it away for various internal machinations of Soviet politics. But that is Russia, Crimea. As much as people hate to admit it, the reality is it is, and the overwhelming majority of the people there are Russian, identify with Russian, and so forth. The rest of it, however, they could have easily kept that into the fold of Ukraine. There was only one proviso, and we all know what that was, and that was the fly in the ointment, and that is NATO membership. And that, according to Washington and its brain trust, was a non-negotiable, and that is one of the biggest mistakes, of course, they've ever made. A neutral Ukraine would have been far superior, been good for everybody. That's the policy Russia had been pursuing forever. And quite frankly, that's the policy that successive Ukrainian administrations were pursuing as well. But you couldn't have that, could you? You couldn't have that, not from Washington's point of view, not from London's point of view, and not from Wall Street and the city of London's point of view. Because they wanted their hands on what's underground there.
And what I mean, you have the classic, you've been lusting for wealth, lusting for power, and then you're going to end up with none of it instead of what you could have had. but that's a separate issue. The last thing I want to talk about here today is we alluded to it a second ago, and it really kind of feeds into the same kind of narrative. It's not in the Russia-Ukraine war. It's actually in the Middle East here, but it's all part and parcel to the same mentality that afflicts really all of Washington right now. And that is former CIA director and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who, in my view, leapt at the opportunity when we had the New Year's Eve, New Year's Day bombing in New Orleans, where the guy claimed that he was had been radicalized by ISIS. I think that he was licking his chops to be happy to try and connect this with what's going on in Syria, to not only not get our troops out, which, by the way, is the logical, rational understanding, because the only reason they're trying to radicalize people here is because we're in their country or on the ground in Syria where they are, killing them on a routine basis. This is the only way they have to strike back. But instead of going the logical way, Pompeo goes like this.
The problem set in Europe fundamentally happened directly because of the absence of American leadership and American deterrence. In the same way that what happened on October 7th was a failure of American leadership. Right. What we saw yesterday, these attacks, these Christmas Day attacks, were serious. President Trump understands this. He's been talking about a conversation with Vladimir Putin that will inevitably have to happen. You have to convince Vladimir Putin that the cost of continuing this conflict exceeds the benefit. And when you don't do that, you get innocents killed all across Ukraine for now over 2 years, coming on 3. Okay. American leadership is important. That will mean leading the Europeans to do what it is they need to do. This is in their backyard. This is a European conflict. President Trump understands that, and we did it for 4 years. We had kept Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine when President Obama couldn't do that, and President Biden clearly didn't either. I'm convinced President Trump and his team can build back a model which will protect America, protect Europe, and make the world more peaceful and stronger as we move into 2025.
I'm sorry, that was not the clip I was thinking of. We grabbed the wrong one there, because what Pompeo was saying, that everything that happened in New Orleans was a direct result of the failure of the Biden administration. Although that one still works, because that the one we just showed reinforces that stuff in this theater here. But that just shows you that Pompeo's ready to talk about anything that keeps war going somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm a little shocked at just side comment. He looks very emaciated. He's lost a lot of weight. I'm shocked to see that Mike Pompeo, so different from the Mike Pompeo that we've seen previously.
I think I read he lost 95 pounds actually.
Unbelievable. So I'm almost worried about him in that respect. But nonetheless, so what he's doing there, the post New Orleans tropes are. It's Biden leaving the border open. ISIS has come over the border. Of course, that's ridiculous because the perpetrator, it was American and he was a military vet, worked for Deloitte. Okay, list goes on. Nothing to do with the border at all. But the opportunism from the political class, from the foreign policy punditry, from the Mike Pompeos of the world, is to say, oh, this is a perfect example of the threat that ISIS poses to the United States. What do we need to do to counter that threat? We need to raise our deployment in northeastern Syria. We need to build that base in Kobani right now, right on the Turkish border. We need to fight ISIS because ISIS has reemerged in Syria and Iraq, as if by magic, as if it had nothing to do with the fact that the Kurds open the prisons, as Damascus fell, to create that exact situation of chaos that would tick all the boxes for Trump to go to the country and say, one more of these crazy, let's be honest, quite unlikely, strange attacks that aren't even attacks. It's hard to know what they are. But one more of these in the pipeline, or a couple more of these, Trump's going to make the case to the nation that we need to fight ISIS again. And that's your war on terror 2.0. Boom. And it's not going to be confined to northeastern Syria or even Iraq. And by the way, U.S. is on very, fragile ground in Iraq. The parliament has declared not once, but twice the United States needs to leave. And the U.S. said, no, we're not leaving. So that would change or give them a stronger position to play against Baghdad on that, but it would also give them a chance to possibly build up some assets on the Iranian border. If this, then you see these two issues colliding. And not only that, they could claim that this is an Afghanistan threat, that the Taliban are basically on the move. I'm hearing this from all the spooks, by the way.
Wow, no kidding. I haven't heard that part.
All they're talking about right now is Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
All the spook sort of, military podcasts and all of this stuff. I think it's because they see Trump coming in. They believe that with Trump, they have a chance because he defers to the generals and Trump likes to align himself with power, military power, that with Pete Hegseth coming in, who's a total war hawk, that somehow they're going to have a chance to rekindle or correct some of the mistakes they made. What Biden did to us in Afghanistan was humiliation, blah, blah, blah. All of these things that they want to re-rectify. With the Trump administration.
I think you'll have a hard time with that because the people that elected Trump are not of that bent. In fact, they didn't want that. So even Trump, I think, would have a hard time making that case.
He would, but if he made the case or the idea was that we had no choice, that we had to because of a threat to America, then that's a different story.
Yeah.
All that campaign rhetoric goes out the door. That's what I'm concerned about. Is that we could very easily retread some of this old ground. And it would ultimately be, I think, a fool's errand, and probably would lead to a wider regional, if not a world war, if that happened. I'm talking about Iran, Israel, the powder keg that already exists there.
Right.
Waiting for a spark to light it off.
Yeah, man. We don't need any of those sparks, man. There's enough of that going on already. But listen, we'll leave it there for the moment. Really appreciate you coming on today and illuminating all these issues and bringing up some new ones even I didn't know about. Oh God, I hope that's just empty talk with the Afghanistan stuff. That's new to me, and that hopefully it stays in the past. But we'll continue to monitor that as it goes along. And truly do appreciate you coming on today and enlightening us on these areas.
Thanks, Daniel.
And we always appreciate you guys. Thank you very much. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't before you leave. And also to let you know, we got a great show coming up this afternoon with Larry Johnson talking about this negotiating bridge to nowhere. We're going to expand on some of the stuff that Patrick and I were just discussing, and we're going to narrow in on really the kind of the heart of this whole thing about whether there is or isn't going to be a negotiated settlement. And that is on what Trump thinks about NATO and Ukraine and what Zelensky thinks about NATO and Ukraine. And how is all that going to work together? Larry will help us unpack some of that stuff this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Be sure to tune in then. We'll look forward to seeing you at that time. See you next time.